All a pedigree is you keeping track of a rabbit's lineage. And if you have a non-pedigreed rabbit, you could easily get a pedigreed line within about 2 to 3 years. So for instance, this is the pedigree that came with my doe, Lizzie. And it has the color, the ear number, the date of birth, the breed, and the sex. Now, I'm going to need to fix this pedigree, so to speak, to add some information to it to ensure that it is correctly filled out. Because if you look back to Lizzie's dad, it has more information, such as a name. But that's not exactly how I prefer to do my pedigrees. Now, this is out of date and it needs some updated information. I normally update my pedigrees once every 3 to 6 months, or if I'm selling them. And as we go back and back and back and back and back on the pedigree, we want all of that filled out so we can register our rabbits. So to pedigree a rabbit is just keeping track of it and putting down specific information. If we want to get technical, the ARBA says that a pedigree is a genealogy of the male and female ancestors, showing the date of birth, the parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. It also contains other information such as color, weight, registration number, etc. A pedigree can give you a lot of information, and although you don't need a pedigree to show a rabbit, you do need a pedigree to register it to the ARBA. Hey look, it's Freak and a son, Freak Jr. So yes, blue-eyed whites and Vienna marked are commonly used as a backyard breeder would use Merle in dogs. It's a favored look for a lot of pet homes, and it's really easy to move through because they are really cute looking. But just like a lot of breeds don't have a standard to allow Merle in them, there are a lot of instances where blue-eyed whites don't meet the standard because of body type, or they don't meet the standard because they're Vienna marked. And I completely agree. I love blue-eyed whites. I loved Vienna marks because they are part of my blue-eyed white program. But I don't really sell any of my Vienna marks, and if I do sell a blue-eyed white, it's show quality. And most of the time it's a boy. Because at the end of the day, I'm not selling pets, and I don't think it's necessarily ethical to pump out pets, especially with the high rate of rabbits in shelters right now. I breed these animals for a standard, and if I don't have need of a Vienna marked kit, I'm going to cull it and eat it. But I completely agree, blue-eyed whites are beautiful. So there can be many variations on a Vienna mark, and I'll show you a couple in my barn. This is B-Ball. She has the presentation of a Vienna mark in the form of an ice blue eye on a blue coat. This is completely out of standard, but it is really pretty, and it's a very easy representation of the Vienna gene. This is Steve. Steve has a very classic representation through the white spot on his nose, and he has a little white spot on his forehead. This is what we typically see in a Vienna presentation on classic markings. This is Daisy. She also has very classic markings through the little spot on her head as well as her nose, and she also has a miscolored eye. As you can see, this eye is normal. This eye has the more bright blue presentation. And then a non-typical presentation when you work with brokens in a boo line, which I don't necessarily recommend unless you have a lot of experience with Vienna marks and blue-eyed whites, is this little guy right here. Not only does he have a no-nose butterfly, he also has what looks like this giant bald spot on his forehead. I've noticed a lot if I have a Vienna carrying parent or if I have a boo parent and I breed them to a broken, I get this formation. It's almost like the Vienna mark spreads from the forehead down the nose. If I were to breed this animal to a blue-eyed white, we would probably get blue-eyed white babies or Vienna carrying babies. But at the end of the day, the Vienna gene is a pain in the butt to deal with. I definitely don't recommend it for most breeders because it takes a lot of cage space for very little results. For instance, you asked me to show a proper show quality boo. I don't have one right now. And that's because it takes me 2 to 3 generations to get a blue-eyed white, let alone to see if it is show quality. I did have a blue-eyed white that was born on the farm about 2 months ago. It was a little buck. It wasn't what I would consider show quality. It had a bit longer of a shoulder, and I gave it to my friend who wanted to start working on blue-eyed whites, who had some of my other stock from my other lines to help improve those lines, because she didn't necessarily have Vienna carrying babies. So I wanted to get her program off the ground, knowing that I myself have plenty of Vienna marked animals to create another boo. When I got my boo stock originally, I had a little doe named Silly Sally, and she was not show quality, but she was a blue-eyed white. And that was enough for me to get hooked and get started into boos. Now the challenge is to do everything I can to improve that part of the breed and to make boos that are perfect. So let's talk about more red flags when buying from a breeder, part 2. So my next red flag is when a breeder doesn't breed to an SOP or the COD. There should be a purpose for which a breeder is breeding. And even if you're breeding for meat, you should be breeding to the standard of perfection. And that's because the standard of perfection is set up to give you the most meat yield for what an animal can produce. And if you're showing, the standard of perfection should always be followed. Now, a certificate of development, or a COD, is a little bit different, and maybe at some point I'll get into that. But either way, those animals are being bred for a purpose. My next breeder red flag is if they don't have a separate quarantine area. So for instance, if I go to look at some animals and I see obvious signs of Pastorella, or I see animals that have wry neck or have some kind of problem and they're in with the rest of the rabbits, I'm going to wonder where the quarantine area is. Because if a rabbit is just left to spread disease, that is a huge problem. Sniffles and RHVD2 can take out an entire herd like it's no one's business. And quarantine areas should be set up. For us, if I don't have anyone in the butcher barn, I will put the rabbit in the butcher barn. If I have animals that are waiting to be butchered, I will put them in the garage. My next red flag is if they don't know basic bunny first aid. As controversial as this is, most of the time our bunnies do not go to the vet. And that is because even though we have a large animal vet and an exotics vet, they don't really know much about rabbits. And that's okay. It's a very small section that's covered in vet school, and if you don't continue your education on it, you don't know it. Plus, I have some really amazing friends who are on this app who either are vets or vet techs that specialize in exotics and rabbits, so I'm very spoiled. But with that being said, a breeder should know basic bunny first aid. You should be able to handle things, such as the procedure for Pastorella, or the procedure for EC, or the procedure for coccidiosis. Not everything is a vet visit because it can be handled at the owner level. And if a breeder doesn't know how to handle that, it's a problem. And everyone starts somewhere, but if it's something you've been doing for a while, you should know the basics. Quail egg hack. So if you hard-boil quail eggs and you have trouble peeling the shells off, put them in white vinegar for about 24 hours after boiling them, and then these shells kind of just poof away and the membranes are just left, and you can peel them off all nice and easy so you don't shred the whites, because if you're like me, you're really bad at peeling hard-boiled eggs. Let's talk about Stormy's fur. For those of you who don't know, Stormy was my blue silver fox that we had culled out because she had another hard labor, and we found out she had ovarian cancer. So right before we had culled her, she had just had a litter of kits. Something that I have noticed when it comes to tanning pelts is that if you have a doe that is recently kindled, like within a day or two of tanning their fur, the fur always slips a bit more than if it were a regular rabbit pelt. And the reason behind this is rabbits will release a hormone around the time they kindle that makes their fur loose, so it's easier to pull to make their fur nests. Now don't get me wrong, I do have fur slippage on other pelts, but not to the level that I see with does that are around the time or right after kindling if we cull them. We're talking giant chunks of fur. And it's a bit annoying because a lot of times there's not much we can do about it, but I'm going to do an experiment to see if I can salvage a fur that does have a doe that has recently kindled in the freezer. Don't know if y'all remember Blue or not, but she's still in the freezer because I had a couple of extra pelts in the freezer. So I'm going to try salt and egg tanning to see if maybe we can salvage that one a little easier compared to Stormy's pelt that the fur just sloughed off. So yeah, the reason it did that was because she had just kindled and the fur was already loose in the skin. No. No. Rick. No, don't move it. Rick. No. Not funny, my guy. Yeah, you're cute. Kisses. Ooh. Rick, you're bad. He's a bad boy. Yes, you are. So I start separating out my males and females when I start weaning them. So at 8 weeks, I'll take the boys away from mom, and then I'll start slowly taking the females off of mom to ensure that she doesn't get mastitis. And the reason why I separate them at 8 weeks is because I don't need any accidental pregnancies, being that the boys breed the girls or the boys breed the mom. Because in theory, the boys aren't fertile till around 12 to 16 weeks, and the girls aren't fertile till around the same time either. That being said, Mother Nature has a way, and there's a reason why people say rabbits breed like rabbits. So my personal opinion is at weaning age, or 8 weeks. So when raising rabbits, you normally have two primary kinds of setups. You have your colony setups and you have your singleton setups. A singleton setup is kind of the setup I have, where you keep single animals in cages, only allowing them to be together to breed and when does have their kits, and occasionally with grow-outs. This setup is a lot more hands-on. Record keeping is way easier, and it's easier to mitigate any kind of health issues you might have. And these health issues can be serious, like the spread of Pasteurella or coccidiosis or RHBD2. Or it can be something as minor as rabbits being under or overweight. Normally, singleton setups are also a lot cleaner, especially if you have a wire flooring. You also don't have to worry about animals in the same cage fighting, or your does randomly getting sick of the buck and biting their nuts off. No, I'm not joking. Your other setup is a colony setup, and there are some benefits to this. It's a lot more hands-off. The rabbits also control their breeding cycles, especially if you have the buck in with the does in a colony setup. I know a lot of people who set this up, they also have less maintenance because they do mass feeds and mass water, and they do it in a way to where the rabbits will litter train themselves, so the cleaning is less often. But record keeping within a colony setup can be very difficult, or in some cases impossible, especially when it comes to pedigrees. I've seen it to where you have multiple does in the same colony give birth and they will tandem nurse, meaning everyone is nursing everyone else's kits, which can be really hard to differentiate who is mom. Not to mention, it's harder to keep track of babies. If you have a true warren setup where the rabbits can dig into the ground and they can kindle into a cave-like system, you won't see those babies until they leave the warren. Meaning you won't know that babies are born until 2-3 weeks of age. It's also very hard to mitigate diseases, meaning if one rabbit gets sick and is contagious, it can take out your entire herd. On one of my meat rabbit groups, I saw that there was a girl who one of her rabbits had gotten RHBD2 and her other rabbits were acting lethargic. Meaning by the time she had caught on to the fact that one of her rabbits had RHBD2, it had already spread it to the rest of the colony. And again, in a colony, it's extremely hard to mitigate aggression, because in a lot of instances, you will not have enough space for a true warren setup. Meaning your territory is not going to be large enough for a buck with multiple does. Because rabbits are extremely territorial, and if not given enough space, they will go after each other.